Have you ever felt like you've done everything to heal, yet something ancient and unspoken still pulls you back? A silence that lives in the body, a trembling in the chest, a shadow that returns at night even when your mind swears it has moved on. This is not weakness nor failure, but the echo of the wounded feminine, a fracture that does not beg for saving but for remembering. For within the hidden places of the soul, there is a girl who once trusted the world to hold her gently. And when that trust was broken, she buried her voice beneath layers of survival. The world taught her to be quiet, to be good, to bend herself into shapes that kept her safe from rejection. She learned to smile when her heart was breaking, to give when her hands were empty, to say yes when every cell in her body screamed no. These small betrayals hardened into armor, yet the armor was not protection but prison. It kept her standing, but it stole her softness. It made her efficient, but it stripped away her wonder. The wounded feminine is not dramatic in her suffering. She is quiet, almost invisible, living behind the mask of strength that others admire yet never truly see. Carl Jung once said that the shadow is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. And for many women, that shadow is not rage or greed, but the forgotten cry of the inner child. She is hidden in the silence of suppressed boundaries, in the numbness that pretends to be strength, in the pleasing smile that hides despair. To remember her is terrifying because it requires peeling back the armor and admitting the vulnerability beneath. But without this remembrance, no healing practice, no affirmation, no ritual of self-care can reach the marrow where the wound still lives. The body remembers what the mind denies. A woman may say she is fine, that the past no longer matters, but her stomach tightens when someone raises their voice. Her throat closes when she tries to speak truth. Her heart races when love approaches too closely. These are not irrational responses. They are the wisdom of a nervous system shaped by betrayal. To deny them is to deepen the wound, but to honor them is to begin the descent into true healing. The wounded feminine cannot be saved by external saviors, for salvation implies passivity. She must be remembered, which is an act of reclamation, a gathering of pieces long scattered across years of silence. Imagine her standing at the edge of a dark forest, a lantern in her hand. The path is not lit, and the forest whispers of danger, but she knows that somewhere within those trees lies the girl she left behind. To step forward is to leave the safety of performance, to question the roles handed down by culture, family, and lovers. To remember is to risk being misunderstood, even rejected, because remembrance disrupts the patterns that once kept her safe. Yet if she refuses the forest, she remains divided, and division is the soil where despair grows. Many women spend decades trying to outrun this forest. They climb ladders of achievement, chase relationships that mimic old wounds, perform caretaking until their bodies collapse, or numb themselves with busyness so that silence cannot speak. Yet the forest waits patiently because time does not erase the unacknowledged. The cost of not entering is subtle at first. Fatigue, emptiness, the sense that no matter how much is given, it is never enough. Eventually the cost grows heavier, turning into illnesses of body and spirit, a quiet hopelessness that whispers, "This is all there will ever be." And yet beneath the weight of that hopelessness, a seed remains. Jung called it the self, the archetype of wholeness that never abandons us. The seed whispers through dreams, through sudden tears at music, through the ache that arises in solitude. It does not demand, but it will not stop calling because it carries the memory of who she was before the wound and who she still can be when she is whole. To hear this whisper is both a blessing and a burden, because once she hears it, she cannot return to the numbness that once protected her. To remember the wounded feminine is to open the door to grief, because grief is the proof of love for the self that was lost. Grief cleanses the soul of pretense, making room for something real to grow. But grief also frightens the modern world, which worships productivity and despises tears. This is why so many women believe they are broken when they cry, when in truth those tears are holy, an initiation into deeper self-knowledge. To weep is to wash away the dust of forgetting. The descent has begun, and though it feels lonely, she is not alone. Every woman who has walked before, every archetypal story of the maiden, the mother, the wise woman, lives within her as compass. The forest is not endless. It is a passage, and the girl she seeks waits not to be rescued but to be held, to be spoken to be remembered as part of her own flesh. The only question is whether she dares to step further in, to face what has been hidden, to hold the child who once carried the wound so bravely. What would happen if she stopped running and turned toward that hidden child within the forest of her soul? The forest of the soul does not reveal its secrets at once. At first, she walks among familiar trees, memories she thought were resolved, but soon the air grows colder, the shadows longer, and she realizes that deeper wounds wait further inside. These are not wounds of surface cuts, but of roots buried in the soil of childhood. They are not single moments, but repeating patterns that taught her to silence her own needs in exchange for belonging. Every step forward feels like betrayal of the family system that shaped her, yet every step backward means betrayal of herself. The wounded feminine often carries contradictions that confuse the mind but make perfect sense to the body. She longs for intimacy yet recoils when someone comes close. She seeks freedom yet clings to relationships that confine her. She yearns to be seen yet fears exposure more than anything. These contradictions are not flaws but survival codes. They were written when she was small and powerless, when dependence was not a choice but a necessity. To decode them requires compassion, because the very strategies that now cause her pain once ensured her survival. Carl Jung wrote that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For the wounded feminine, fate often appears as repeated betrayals, as lovers who echo the rejection of her father, as friendships that mirror the envy of her mother, as workplaces where her worth is extracted without recognition. She wonders why the cycle never ends, not realizing that the unconscious seeks healing through repetition. Each encounter is not punishment but invitation, a mirror held up by life, asking her to see the pattern and claim the power to end it. Yet this invitation is not gentle. It arrives through heartbreak, abandonment, betrayal, and loss. It strips away illusions, leaving her raw and unguarded. In these moments, she often feels cursed, as if life is against her, when in truth life is conspiring for her liberation. The wound cannot be remembered in comfort, because comfort was the mask that hid it. Only when the mask cracks does the child's cry echo through, asking to be acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement lies the doorway to freedom, though the passage is narrow and filled with grief. The body continues to guide her, even when the mind resists. Nightmares bring back faces from the past. Anxiety arises in rooms that seem harmless. Fatigue clings to her even after rest. These are not malfunctions but signals, the language of the nervous system. They remind her that healing is not about erasing the past but integrating it. The child she abandoned does not want explanations or justifications. She wants presence. She wants to be held in memory, not erased. She wants to hear, "You were right to feel hurt. You were right to be angry. You deserved love and it was not your fault." This is where many turn away, because to sit with that child is to reopen grief, rage, and sorrow. The mind resists, insisting that the past is gone, that dwelling only makes things worse. But shadow work is not dwelling, it is witnessing. Without witnessing, the child remains locked in silence, and the adult self keeps carrying the weight of her unspoken pain. To remember her is not to drown in the past, but to reclaim the pieces of soul trapped there, pieces that hold innocence, creativity, and joy as much as they hold grief. The culture rarely teaches this kind of remembrance. Instead, it tells women to be strong, to move on, to forgive without process, to be grateful because others had it worse. These demands silence the wound further, turning it into a private ache carried behind a bright smile. Yet the soul knows the truth, and truth cannot be silenced forever. One day the body refuses, the spirit rebels, and the woman realizes that strength without softness is emptiness, that forgiveness without grief is false, that gratitude without honesty is shallow. She realizes that the path of real healing cannot be borrowed from culture. It must be forged within. And so she begins to ask questions she once avoided. Who was I before I learned to please? When did I first betray my own no? What masks have I worn to keep others comfortable? These questions sting because each answer reveals a moment of abandonment, not by others alone, but by herself. Yet the sting is sacred, for it is the sting of truth, and truth is the medicine that breaks illusion. To answer these questions is to gather the fragments of her soul scattered across years, to begin weaving them back into wholeness. The forest responds to her courage. With each question asked, the path clears a little more. Memories surface, not to torment her but to release her. She begins to see that the wound was never just a personal failure but part of a collective story, a generational pattern carried by women before her. Her mother's silence, her grandmother's sacrifice, the centuries of voices that taught women to disappear, all of it lives in her, yet none of it defines her. To remember the wound is to remember the lineage, but also to choose differently, to become the point where the pattern ends. And still the child waits, deeper in the forest, holding both pain and promise. She is not an image of weakness but a guardian of truth. The woman senses that when she meets this child, something irreversible will happen. The mask will fall, the old roles will lose their power, and a new identity will begin to take form. Yet the child will not come forward unless she is approached with reverence, for she has been abandoned too many times. The woman must decide. Will she keep walking, or will she turn away and remain divided? What would change if she had the courage to look that child in the eyes and whisper the words she has longed to hear all her life? The forest thickens as she walks further, and with it comes the weight of memories she once refused to touch. At first they appear as fragments, flashes of a slammed door, a voice raised in anger, a silence that felt like abandonment. Then they sharpen into scenes her body never forgot, the moments when her innocence was pierced by betrayal. These are not merely events, they are imprints. Each one left a mark on her nervous system, teaching her what was safe to feel, what was forbidden to speak, what parts of herself must be hidden to survive. The wounded feminine does not always bleed in obvious ways. Sometimes she looks like the caretaker who never asks for help, the overachiever who earns love through performance, the dreamer who hides her creativity because it was once mocked. She appears in the woman who settles for crumbs of affection, who apologizes for existing, who swallows her rage because she was told anger is unfeminine. These are the disguises of the wound, masks so convincing that even she forgets what is underneath. Yet the body remembers, and the body will not be deceived forever. The confrontation begins when the masks no longer protect. The strategies that once ensured survival start to crumble. She gives and is still abandoned. She achieves and still feels worthless. She pleases and still feels unloved. At first she panics, clinging harder to the old patterns, but each attempt deepens the despair. The old medicine has become poison, forcing her to face the truth. The wound cannot be healed by repeating the cycle. To break free, she must step into the fire of remembrance, where denial burns away and only truth remains. This fire is terrifying because it demands she feel what she has avoided for so long. Grief rises like a storm, and with it comes anger, shame, and fear. These emotions are not comfortable, yet they are sacred messengers. Jung understood this when he taught that the shadow must be integrated, not destroyed. The shadow holds the energy of all that was repressed. Within her rage lies the power to set boundaries. Within her grief lies the capacity for deep love. Within her shame lies the path to reclaim innocence. To confront these emotions is not to be consumed by them, but to harvest their hidden gifts. The child within does not appear as a victim but as the keeper of these emotions. She carries the anger that was silenced, the tears that were forbidden, the joy that was mocked. To meet her is to meet the raw essence of self. Yet the woman often resists, fearing that to open to the child will mean drowning in pain. But the opposite is true. The child does not want to drown her. She wants to be seen, to be spoken to be remembered as real. When the woman kneels in the forest and opens her arms, the child does not attack. She waits with wide eyes, wondering if this time will be different. And here lies the moment of confrontation, the mirror Jung spoke of, when a soul must face itself without disguise. Will she turn away as others did, leaving the child alone once more, or will she gather the courage to stay? The mirror asks, who abandoned you first, others or yourself, when you chose silence over truth? This question cuts to the core, for it reveals that healing is not about blaming the past but about reclaiming the present. She cannot change what was done, but she can choose no longer to abandon herself. The forest grows silent as this realization sinks in. The child steps closer, carrying both wound and wisdom. In her eyes is the reflection of 1,000 unspoken truths. Every time she said yes when she wanted to scream no, every time she smiled to hide tears, every time she loved those who could not love her back. The woman feels the weight of those years pressing down, but also something unexpected, a flicker of compassion. For the first time, she sees not weakness but strength in the child. Survival itself was an act of courage. The very strategies that now bind her were once the only path to safety. This compassion is the threshold. Without it, the confrontation becomes self-punishment. With it, the confrontation becomes liberation. She realizes that to meet the child is not to reopen the wound but to return what was stolen: dignity, innocence, belonging. The fire of remembrance burns brighter, but instead of consuming her, it purifies. The illusions of worthlessness, weakness, and failure turn to ash, and in the clearing stands the child, luminous and waiting. The woman reaches out, trembling, and the child does not resist. They touch hands, and in that touch something ancient shifts. The divide between past and present begins to close. The memories remain, but their grip loosens, for they are no longer hidden. The shadow is no longer an enemy but a guide. What was once unbearable becomes bearable, not because the pain has vanished, but because it is finally held. And in that holding, the woman senses the possibility of becoming whole. The confrontation is not a single moment but a turning point. From here, the path will still be difficult, but it will no longer be walked in denial. The forest no longer feels endless because now she knows what she is searching for. She is searching for the pieces of self she abandoned, and one by one she will bring them back. Yet a question lingers, heavy and luminous, waiting at the edge of her awareness. If the wounded child is no longer abandoned, then who will the woman become when she finally stands whole? The question echoes in the silence. Who will she become when she finally stands whole? The forest does not answer with words but with images. She sees women throughout time, some with heads bowed, some with hands bound, some with eyes burning like fire. She realizes that the wound she carries is not hers alone but part of a collective inheritance, a script written into the bodies of countless women before her. To remember her own wound is to remember theirs as well, to become the living thread that weaves pain into meaning and meaning into freedom. The child within does not vanish once held. She begins to speak. Her voice is small but steady, asking questions that pierce through the layers of survival. Why did you leave me behind? Why did you believe you were unworthy? Why did you give away your softness as though it had no value? The woman listens with trembling honesty, because these are not accusations but long silenced truths. To answer requires humility, to admit that self-betrayal was once a way of surviving, but that survival is no longer enough. She promises the child that she will not turn away again. With this promise, the body begins to shift. Where there was once tightness, there is breath. Where there was numbness, there are tears. Where there was silence, there is voice. The nervous system, long trapped in patterns of fear, starts to trust that presence is possible. This is not an instant transformation, but a gradual unwinding, like ice melting under the warmth of spring. Each thawed layer reveals memories, emotions, and forgotten dreams. Instead of drowning in them, she learns to sit beside them, to listen without judgment, to hold them as she holds the child. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming whole, integrating all that was split apart. For the wounded feminine, individuation requires reclaiming not only the child, but also the parts of her shadow once exiled. The rage that was called dangerous becomes the fire that protects her boundaries. The grief that was called weakness becomes the well of empathy that connects her to others. Even her shame, once unbearable, becomes the teacher that reminds her she was never meant to live according to someone else's measure of worth. Each shadow, once integrated, turns from enemy into ally. This integration births a new kind of strength, not the brittle strength of endurance, but the supple strength of authenticity. She no longer wears the mask of perfection, because she no longer fears her imperfections. She no longer begs for crumbs of love, because she recognizes that her worth is not negotiable. She no longer silences her voice to keep the peace, because she understands that peace built on suppression is not peace at all but imprisonment. This strength does not shout. It radiates, a quiet authority that comes from knowing she has survived the fire and emerged with her soul intact. The collective wound begins to loosen its grip through her transformation. Each time she chooses to honor her truth, she interrupts the pattern passed down through generations. Each time she comforts her inner child, she heals not only herself but also the invisible lineage of women silenced before her. In this way, her healing is not selfish but revolutionary. It ripples outward, affecting her relationships, her choices, even the world she helps shape. She becomes both woman and archetype, a living symbol of the feminine remembered. The path is not without challenge. The outer world continues to echo the old patterns, testing her resolve. She encounters people who expect her silence, systems that undervalue her worth, relationships that tempt her to abandon herself again. But something within has shifted irreversibly. She recognizes these tests for what they are, invitations to embody the truth she has remembered. Instead of collapsing into old wounds, she stands rooted, her boundaries clear, her voice steady. The child within is no longer hidden. She walks beside her, a constant reminder of innocence reclaimed. The question returns, more insistent now. Who will she become when she finally stands whole? She sees glimpses. A woman who creates not to please but to express. A woman who loves not to earn worth but because her heart is abundant. A woman who stands in silence without fear, who speaks without apology, who weeps without shame. She sees a woman who no longer divides her soul into acceptable and unacceptable parts, but who embodies the full spectrum of what it means to be alive. This vision is not fantasy. It is prophecy, seated in the very womb that once defined her. And yet prophecy alone is not enough. To embody it requires choice again and again in the small moments of daily life. It requires saying no when old patterns demand a yes. It requires resting when the world demands productivity. It requires speaking truth even when voices tremble. Each choice becomes a stitch in the fabric of wholeness, weaving together the woman and the child, the shadow and the light, the past and the present. Slowly, she becomes the answer to the question the forest first asked. But another question stirs beneath the surface, quieter but sharper. If she truly embraces this wholeness, what parts of her old life will no longer survive? The quiet question pierces her deeper than any before. If she truly embraces wholeness, what parts of her old life will no longer survive? For the wounded feminine does not heal in abstraction. She heals in the living of her days. To embody the remembrance means shedding skins that once defined her. Friendships built on her silence may fall away. Work that demanded her exhaustion may no longer hold meaning. Relationships that thrived on her self-abandonment may crumble when she refuses to play the old role. The cost of wholeness is the death of illusion, and death, even when necessary, is never easy. At first, grief swells as she watches parts of her life dissolve. It feels as though she is betraying others, but in truth, she is refusing to betray herself again. This grief is different from the grief of abandonment. It is the grief of choosing integrity over compromise. Each farewell, each shedding is both wound and liberation. Like leaves falling in autumn, it makes room for the new growth that spring will bring. She learns that endings are not failures but thresholds, the necessary emptiness that prepares the soul for rebirth. As she sheds, the child within grows stronger. No longer hidden in shadows, she begins to play, to create, to laugh with unguarded joy. Her innocence is no longer fragile but radiant, because it is held in the arms of the woman who has vowed never to abandon her again. Together, they weave a new rhythm of life, one not built on pleasing or proving but on listening and honoring. The child offers wonder, the woman offers wisdom, and together they create a wholeness neither could achieve alone. In this wholeness, she discovers a new relationship with power, not the power of domination or control, but the power of presence, the kind of power that does not beg to be recognized because it is undeniable. When she enters a room, she does not shrink or inflate, she simply is. This presence unsettles those who once relied on her compliance, but it inspires those who are searching for their own remembrance. She becomes a mirror not only for herself, but for others, a living symbol that wholeness is possible, that the wound can be transformed into wisdom. The integration of shadow becomes more than inner work. It becomes a way of moving through the world. Her rage becomes the fire that fuels justice. Her grief becomes the bridge that connects her to humanity. Her softness becomes a strength that disarms pretense. She no longer sees emotions as enemies but as sacred guides, each carrying its own wisdom. In honoring them, she honors life itself, refusing the numbness that once dulled her soul. This refusal is revolutionary in a world that profits from women forgetting themselves. Yet the world continues to test her. Invitations to return to old patterns arrive disguised as comfort, as nostalgia, as the temptation to trade authenticity for approval. Each time she faces the choice, she feels the trembling of the child within, remembering the countless times they were abandoned before. But now she chooses differently. She holds the child close, whispers words of reassurance, and walks forward. The path is not easy, but it is clear. No more betrayal, no more silence, no more shrinking into shadows that never belonged to her. This steadfastness births a new kind of love within her. It is not the desperate love that clings for fear of loneliness, nor the conditional love that bargains for worth. It is a love rooted in presence, a love that begins with the self and radiates outward. She loves her own wounds not because they were pleasant, but because they carried her to remembrance. She loves her own body not because it fits an ideal, but because it has endured, carrying her through fire and back again. This love does not need to be earned or proven. It simply is, a state of being that transforms everything it touches. With this love, she steps into embodiment. Embodiment is not a concept but a way of living where the inner and outer worlds align. Her voice matches her truth, her choices match her values, her presence matches her essence. She does not separate healing from life. Healing becomes life itself, an ongoing dance of remembering and returning. She does not wait for the world to grant her permission. She grants it to herself, and in doing so, she becomes free. But freedom, too, carries weight. For to embody wholeness is to live without excuses, without hiding behind wounds or waiting for saviors. It is to carry responsibility for her own becoming. The forest has led her here to the edge of a clearing where the horizon stretches wide and open. Behind her lies the landscape of wounds and shadows. Before her lies the unknown, a life yet unwritten. The question is no longer whether she will remember the wounded feminine, but how she will live now that she has. And so, as the child takes her hand and the fire of remembrance burns steady in her chest, another question arises, the sharpest of all. When the old self is gone and the new self stands whole, will she dare to step fully into the life that once terrified her? The horizon stretches before her, vast and uncharted, and the final question burns in her mind. Will she dare to step fully into the life that once terrified her? For wholeness is not a sanctuary she enters once and remains forever. It is a living practice, a constant remembering. The temptation to return to the old patterns lingers, for they are familiar, and the familiar always whispers of safety, even when it suffocates. Yet something within her has changed irrevocably. She has seen the child, she has held the wound, she has walked through the fire, and there is no going back to the numbness that once felt like home. To step into this new life means embracing the paradox of vulnerability and strength. Vulnerability is no longer the weakness she once feared, but the doorway to authenticity. It allows her to be seen in her fullness, not as a mask of perfection, but as a living, breathing soul. Strength is no longer endurance at all costs, but the courage to align with truth even when it costs her approval. Together, these two forces shape her into something deeper than either alone, a woman who belongs to herself. Belonging to herself is the great reversal of the wound. For so long she bent herself to belong to others, sacrificing voice and boundaries to earn conditional love. Now she understands that true belonging can only begin within. From this inner belonging, every relationship is transformed. She no longer seeks saviors, nor does she shrink to make others comfortable. She meets others as equals, capable of giving and receiving, but no longer willing to exchange self-betrayal for affection. This changes the very rhythm of love in her life, weaving relationships not of need, but of resonance. The child within continues to walk beside her, no longer hidden in shadows but alive in the light. Together they embody a union Jung described as the integration of opposites. The innocence of the child and the wisdom of the woman are not rivals but partners, each carrying what the other lacks. The child brings wonder, spontaneity, creativity, and play. The woman brings discernment, protection, and grounded strength. In their union, she becomes whole, no longer split between past and present, between shadow and light. She becomes the archetype of the remembered feminine, a living bridge between wound and wholeness. This wholeness radiates outward into her work, her art, her relationships, and her presence in the world. She no longer chases meaning because she embodies it. She no longer grasps at worth because she knows it. The very air around her shifts, as though life itself recognizes her alignment. Opportunities arise not because she begs for them, but because her presence attracts them. Relationships deepen not because she sacrifices herself, but because she shows up fully. In every arena of life, she becomes both anchor and flame, steady and luminous, unshakable and alive. Yet even here, challenges remain. The world does not easily accept women who belong to themselves. Old narratives will still. They'll whisper that she is too much, too loud, too soft, too ambitious, too free. These whispers no longer control her, but they still test her. Each time she hears them, she remembers the forest, the child, the fire of remembrance. She remembers that every no to self-betrayal is a yes to freedom. And so she chooses again each day to stand whole, to live aligned, to embody the feminine remembered. In this embodiment, a final truth dawns. The wounded feminine was never meant to be saved because she was never broken beyond repair. She was hidden, silenced, fragmented, but not destroyed. To save her would imply passivity, waiting for a rescuer. To remember her is to actively reclaim, to take responsibility for the sacred work of healing. This is the essence of empowerment, not waiting for permission, not waiting for rescue, but becoming the one who gathers the fragments and makes them whole. And now, as she stands at the edge of the forest looking out at the open horizon, she knows the answer to the question that has followed her from the beginning. What happens when she stops running and turns toward the child within? She remembers. She remembers the softness that was never weakness, the fire that was never rage, the innocence that was never truly lost. She remembers that the wound was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her becoming. The prophecy fulfills itself here, not in a grand revelation, but in a quiet embodiment. She is no longer split between survival and self, between mask and truth. She is woman remembered, whole, rooted, radiant. The forest behind her does not vanish. It remains, a reminder of the path she walked. But it no longer binds her. It has become part of her, integrated into the story of her becoming. She steps into the horizon, carrying the child, the shadow, the light, the wound, and the wholeness as one. And the final question remains, not as burden but as invitation. Now that she remembers who she truly is, how will she choose to live each day in the fullness of her freedom?